Hello, welcome to the League of Women Voters Wichita Metro and our annual unit meeting. I know this is a little less traditional. Usually we have it a little later in the month, but today we knew that this information could not wait. We are so excited that you're here with us and really excited to be able to share more with you. Feel free to share this information, share this video and other things with your friends, your family, and all people that are voting in Kansas so they are super educated on lots of different components that are going to be on our ballot this coming November. Today is the last day. Tomorrow, actually, is the last day to register to vote. So sorry. So tomorrow is the last day to register to vote here in Kansas. So if you or anyone you know is not registered to vote at this time, this is a great time to have that happen. You can go to many different resources and websites to make sure that this is done. But a couple that we know that are really great are vote411.org and votekyes.org. We're really excited to have you here tonight. I am honored to introduce Amii Castle. Amii Castle is a professor at KU Law and has her Juris Doctorate as well. She teaches electronic discovery, advanced electronic discovery. She's not here just for the basic stuff. She's here for the advanced as well, and Petria Law at KU Law. She also teaches business law at the KU School of Business as well. She is all over the place, also teaching constitutional law in the political science department. She brings a wealth of knowledge from private practice in the law field, as well as from perspectives from the federal bench. I'm so excited to have her here tonight sharing with us more about each of the constitutional amendments that will be on our ballot this November, as well as how the Supreme Court judges are in their election is on our ballot as well, and their retention vote. So please welcome Amii Castle. I'm so glad to have you here tonight, and I'm really excited for this awesome presentation. All right, Amii, take it away.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. Sound check, everything good. I'll assume I'll hear different if not. Thank you for the warm and lovely introduction. I'm so happy to be here to talk about what's on the ballot, about these two proposed constitutional amendments, and then what is this business about retention of judges and why are we going to have so many on our ballot, because we will. So I don't need to go through this. I've already been properly introduced. So what I'd like to do before we start talking about the amendments, which is super important, we'll get to that in just a moment. But I thought I'd just do a quick rundown of actually what's on the ballot, or more appropriately, who's on the ballot, what offices are we going to be voting for starting on Wednesday if you're an early voter. So we know that big race, governor's race is on the ballot. We've got incumbent Laura Kelly, who is being challenged by current Attorney General and then candidate for governor Derek Schmidt. We've got the Attorney General's race. On the Republican side, we've got Chris Kobach, who is running against Chris Mann on the Democratic ticket. Then we have Secretary of State. So our current incumbent is Republican Scott Schwab, and Scott Schwab's challenger is Democrat Gina Repass. And then we have insurance commissioner. I did not commit the names to memory, but we do have a Democrat and we do have a Republican on the ballot for insurance commissioner. We also will be voting in Kansas on a state senator. Jerry Moran is our current state senator. I'm sorry, not state, United States senator. My bad on that. So he's been our senator representing us in D.C. Since 2010, and his Democratic challenger is Mark Holland. Now, actually, I don't need to do this part because y'all are Sedgwick County. So I don't even need to go into the craziness of the House, our districts, how they got super crazy. That doesn't apply to you all. So you will not be voting on any state senators. So all of the state senators, all 40 of them, will be up for reelection in 2024. But what you will be voting on is your own state representative, whatever state district in which you live. You'll be voting on your state rep because they're up every 2 years. You'll be voting on candidates to fill the state board of education. And again, y'all aren't in Douglas County, so we don't need to talk about that. All right, so that's who's on the ballot, right? Those are the candidates. It's a healthy ballot. Let's just say lots of candidates for whom you can cast your ballot. So let's talk about these two proposed constitutional amendments, which is actually probably why you're here. So as you know, because you're attending and you want to become informed, there are two proposed state constitutional amendments that we're going to be voting on. Now we're all pretty primed from August 2nd. I talked to a lot of people back in the summer who didn't even really get that we had a state constitution, right? We have a federal constitution, but every state has their own constitution, and those state constitutions, they can't take away our federal rights; they can only add to them. So when we're talking about these two proposed constitutional amendments, we're talking about amendments to that would change our state constitution, our Kansas constitution. So our Kansas constitution was ratified in 1861. We've amended it 98 times. Now, when we amend our constitution, either our state or our federal, we don't go back and change the text, right? We just add to it. So we've added to our state constitution 98 times. So there's two amendments, and we're going to take them separately because they're completely separate. Okay. And I hope to break them down for you. So the First Amendment, I've actually gone in and looked at my sample ballot, and this is the amendment that will appear first on your ballot. This is what it's titled by the legislature, is the legislative veto or suspension of executive agency regulations amendment. So that's sort of a mouthful. Now, what I want to do with these amendments is I'm going to show you the text, what you're going to see on your ballot. Okay. And I'm a law professor. I was a practicing lawyer for 20 years, and I guarantee there's not many of you or me who, when you read the amendments, you're actually going to be able to make heads or tails, particularly if you are there at the voting booth. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you the actual wording that you'll see, and then I'm just going to start paraphrasing it down, and then I'll show you what that means, how that would change the way we do things in Kansas if these amendments are passed. Oh, sorry, I was pushing my normal button. So this is the text of the legislative veto amendment. And so this is the only one I'll do this on, but just to show you how crazy the wording is. Whenever the legislature by law has authorized any officer or agency within the executive branch or government to adopt rules and regulations that have the force and effect of law, the legislature may provide by law for the revocation or suspension of any such rule and regulation or any portion thereof upon a vote of a majority of each of the members of then elected or appointed and qualified in each house. Now, did y'all get that? Right? Did you understand that? Well, I certainly didn't the first time I read it, or the 10th time that I read it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to sort of paraphrase it down for you. Okay, so this is Amy's paraphrasing, and then I'm going to make it even more simple. So this is sort of my paraphrasing. Whenever an agency within the executive branch of government adopts rules or regulations, the legislature may revoke or suspend any such rules or regulations upon a simple majority vote of legislators. That still doesn't really help a whole bunch, right? It's still a whole bunch of words. So at the end of the day, what this amendment will do, it would give our state legislature the power to revoke or suspend rules adopted by our state administrative agencies by a simple majority vote. Now, you might be thinking, well, that's, not really a big deal. How, what do we do now, and how would this change things, right? So if this amendment passes, okay, if a yes vote passes, we need to figure out what the change would be. So we got to look at things the way they are now, right? So we go back to basic high school civics, right? We've got three branches of government. We have our legislature that passes the law, we have our executive branch that enforces the law, and then we have our judiciary that interprets the law. So when we're talking about this amendment, we are talking about this notion that we have, that the idea is that we have three separate co-equal branches, that when they want to do something, there's another branch that has a check on them, right? So they don't get too powerful or abuse their power. So where this comes into play is this notion that we have executive agencies. We have state executive agencies, okay, and they fall under the executive branch. So the legislature passes laws and said this will be the law, right? But it's those executive agencies that actually adopt rules and regulations to implement those laws. And so when we're talking about these executive agencies, might not sound like a big deal, but these agencies are incredibly important to our state government. We have 13 official executive agencies in Kansas. So we're talking about the Department of Health and Environment. We're talking about the Department of Labor, the Department of Agriculture, the Department of Revenue. All of those are state executive agencies that employ experts in their fields, right? And they're trying to determine what rules and regulations to adopt to enforce the laws of the legislature. So these executive agencies, they make rules and regulations. So now let's say, let's just take as an example, okay? Let's take the Department of, or the Kansas Department of Health and Environment. So the Kansas Department of Health and Environment, their whole goal, their whole task is to protect us, right? Protect our safety, protect the environment. And so as part of the function of that administrative agency, is the agency regulates, for example, water pollution, right? How much pollution can be in our lakes and our streams, right? Before it becomes unhealthy. So let's say that the Department of Health and Environment passes a rule or regulation, we'll just call it a regulation, that limits businesses from dumping toxic chemicals into our natural waterways. And mind you, when these agencies adopt regulations, they've almost always done it after a period of comment from the public, right? They have a chance to comment on it. There's lots of thought and consideration into adopting these regulations. So let's say Kansas Department of Health and Environment adopts a rule, a regulation. Companies, you can't just willy-nilly dump your toxic chemicals into our water streams. So now, if the Kansas legislature, if our legislature, our Republican-led legislature, let's say they don't like that regulation, okay? Because as we know, some in the Republican legislature don't like regulations. They think it costs businesses money. So let's say that the legislature doesn't like that regulation, and so they want to strike that. They have a path to do that right now, and the path is the way they do any other legislative action. They have to pass a law that would strike down that regulation. So I keep going to the wrong button. So how does a law get passed? As we know, there is somebody, a legislator has to introduce a bill saying we don't like the regulation that limits toxic chemicals. So what happens next? Then that bill goes to the House and the Senate. And if 51% of our state legislators in the House and the Senate believe that it's a good thing, we don't want that regulation, right? That's chasing away business. We don't want to regulate toxic chemicals in our waterways. So if 51% of our legislators agree, all well and good, but like any other law, what happens is that that bill then goes to the governor, right? And then the governor has the opportunity to veto that bill that would revoke the regulation against toxic chemical dumping. And so if the governor vetoes a bill, then we know the legislature can still pass that law, right? They just have to have a veto proof majority or 75%, right? And so that's how it stands now, right? Kansas Department of Health and Environment adopts a regulation, stop dumping toxic chemicals in our waterways. The Republican-led legislature doesn't like that law. Well, they can challenge it, right? They can strike it down through the process by which they would go through for any other legislative action. So what the amendment would do if it's passed, it would take the governor completely out of the equation. It would give the governor no veto power over any bill that is passed to revoke an agency rule or regulation. So, what that means is that if the amendment passes, and let's take our hypothetical regulation, 51% of Republican legislators say, nah, we don't like that regulation. We want to revoke it. Well, if the amendment passes, all that's needed is 51% of our state legislature. It never goes to the governor. The governor never has a chance to veto it. And no more than 51% of our state legislators is required to strike down that regulation. So it literally is taking power from one branch of government, the executive branch of government, and transferring that power, giving that power to the legislature so that the legislature, rather than a two-thirds majority that would be required to strike down a regulation, only needs 51% or a simple majority of our state legislators. So that's the legislative veto amendment, and I know, so at the end of the day, what the amendment will do is to give the legislature the power by a simple majority to revoke or suspend agency rules, these agencies who are probably experts in their field, and we're going to give that power to state legislators to decide whether to revoke or suspend agency rules. So that's the legislative veto amendment. Let's now hop to the sheriff's amendment. Okay. Oh, sorry. Here is a yes vote supports this constitutional amendment and would give the legislature the power by a 51% majority to suspend or revoke agency rules. A no vote keeps the status quo. A no vote requires that the legislature, like any other legislative action, has to pass a law in order to revoke an agency rule. All right, so that's the legislative veto amendment. Let's talk about the sheriff's amendment, and which is called the County Sheriff Election and Recall Amendment. So, as the title suggests, there are actually two parts to this amendment, and I'm gonna break it down in two parts because they're not really related so much. What we're talking about when we're talking about the sheriff's amendment, we're talking about I changing how we elect sheriffs and how we remove sheriffs. So two distinct pieces of this amendment. So let's start. We're going to start with the easy part. I tell my students we always start with the easy stuff, right? Then we move into the little more complicated. But let's start with the election of sheriffs and how this constitutional amendment would change how we elect our sheriffs. So I'm actually not going to read this one to you, but this literally is the text that you will see on your ballot. And at the end of the day, it will tell you, and I'll do a little paraphrasing, but it will tell you that from here forward, every county in Kansas must have an elected sheriff as their top law enforcement person. So the amendment says from here forward, the top law enforcement officer in any county has to be elected, has to be answerable to the voters. So now here's where it gets a little confusing, but not confusing, because when you read the amendment and it's like all, it feels like it's creating exceptions for all these counties. And here's the deal. At the end of the day, there is one county currently who does not have an elected sheriff. That's Riley County, and I'll talk a little bit more about this in a minute, but that's because Riley County back in 1974 created a consolidated government. They consolidated their county and their city government. And under Kansas law, when a county and a city consolidate, they don't have to have an elected sheriff. So Riley County did this way back when. And so what the amendment really affects is all the remaining 104 counties. So the first blurb in the text of the amendment of this only applies for is just crazy. Just it doesn't apply to Riley County. It applies to the remaining 104 counties in Kansas. If the amendment passes, then all 140 counties in the future have to have an elected sheriff as their top law enforcement officer. Now, so here's the deal. Currently, the remaining 104 counties in Kansas already elect their sheriffs. And so, and so the amendment would affect only future counties, would require in the future that counties have an elected sheriff. And so I want to come back to this notion of a consolidated government and why this might come into play. So when you have a so if we're already doing things this way, what is the concern? Well, as I preluded, when a county and a city can consolidate, they can say, it'd be way more efficient if we just consolidated all of our operations. And by Kansas law, they can do that. And so if a county and a city decide to consolidate, then what happens is that a law enforcement agency board is created. Okay. And that board, which is people, will then appoint as the top person, right, a police director. And so in a consolidated government, what that means is that by Kansas law, currently, there is no elected highest law enforcement officer in a county. If a county and a city consolidate, by law, they have an appointed police director. And so what this amendment would do would say, oh no, that law is unconstitutional, right? It doesn't follow the Constitution. And so passing this amendment would prohibit future county and city governments who consolidate to simply appoint a police director. There has to still be an elected sheriff, an elected county law enforcement person answerable to the voters. So that's at the end of the day, right? That's what that part of the Second Amendment would do. Say, hey, in those 104 counties that already elect their sheriffs, going forward, you're going to have an elected person as your top county law enforcement official, whether or not you consolidate or not. So that's the election of sheriffs. What does the amendment do with respect to changing how we can remove our sheriffs? So, again, I won't read you the text verbatim, okay? But at the end of the day, what the amendment is going to tell you is, first of all, county officials can be removed from office if they're, behaving badly. And then the way that a county sheriff can be removed from office is only two ways: by a recall of the voters, which currently exists. The amendment doesn't change that at all. Or if the attorney general wants to initiate an investigation into a sheriff, only the attorney general has the power to initiate an investigation into a sheriff. That's what changes. So so at the end of the day, and we'll get there, I promise, but at the end of the day, what the amendment does is it takes away power from all local county attorneys to initiate an investigation into a sheriff who has engaged in misconduct. And so let's talk about the easy part of the hard part first, okay? So how would this amendment change our laws as we know them now? Well, let's talk about the recall and the voter recall. So the constitutional amendment that's proposed wouldn't change the power of the voters to recall a sheriff, right? To vote a sheriff out. And so that process would stay the same. There's always an avenue. If I am not happy with my sheriff, and I want to get my friends, family, and neighbors who agree with me that we're not happy with our sheriff, well, I can start a petition, a recall petition. And if I can get 40%, if I can get signatures that equal to 40% of those who voted in the sheriff's election, then I can present my petition to my county election official. And then that issue is going to be on the ballot. And that question will be, do we recall our sheriff? And if 51% of my friends, family, and neighbors believe that our sheriff should be recalled, then the voters can vote the bastard out, right? So the power of voters to recall a sheriff that they don't like, that remains. That does not change at all under the amendment. We always have the power as voters to recall our elected sheriffs. Where the change is, what would change, and it could be a pretty significant change, is this idea that in addition to a recall of the voters, or a recall by the voters, the only way that a sheriff can be investigated for misconduct is if an official legal proceeding is filed. And it's a silly name. I learned it in law school. I don't think I used it for a quarter of a century until this amendment came up. But it's called a quo warranto proceeding. And it's basically a proceeding that is filed in court that says, hey, there might be a sheriff who is engaged in misconduct. And so that would initiate an investigation. And ultimately, at the end of the day, it's going to be a judge who's going to decide whether a sheriff has engaged in misconduct. So what the amendment does is it gives that power to initiate an investigation solely and only to the attorney general. Now, you might say, well, why is that even important? Like, well, currently in our state, if a local county attorney believes that a sheriff has engaged in shenanigans, right? Mishandled evidence or tampered with evidence in a criminal case, or did something right improper. Well, right now, according to state law, either a local county attorney or the attorney general can file this legal proceeding to initiate this investigation. And if you think about it, that's kind of an important potential function for a local county or district attorney, because like, who's working with the sheriff on a daily basis, right? Who actually might know if a sheriff is engaged in some sort of misbehavior or misconduct? Well, it's probably going to be the local county attorney. It's probably not going to be the attorney general who sits in Topeka most days, right? So I'll give you a little visual. So I live in Douglas County. Um, and so let's say that my sheriff, who has not engaged in any shenanigans in which I am, of which I know, but let's say that we've got a sheriff who's doing some bad things. So as Kansas law stands now, either the local district attorney or the attorney general can file a proceeding and have it go through the court and have that sheriff investigated. So in Douglas County, our district attorney is Suzanne Valdez. And as we know, our attorney general for everyone in the state of Kansas right now is Derek Schmidt. So currently, right now, both have the power to file a proceeding to investigate a sheriff. Now, we also know that we're not going to have Derek Schmidt as our Attorney General, and we know that that's either going to be Chris Kobach or Chris Mann. So when that happens, if this amendment passes, what this amendment does is take the local district attorney completely out of the equation. The local district attorney has no power to file any sort of proceeding, to initiate an investigation into a sheriff, and that power will rest with the attorney general only. And so, if you kind of think that through, if you've got a local county attorney, in Southwest Kansas, who thinks that a sheriff is up to no good. Well, that local county attorney, if the amendment passes, has no power, no power to ask for an investigation into that sheriff. So what the local attorney now has to do is call whoever's in office in Topeka and say, "Hey, will you start an investigation into the sheriff?" And here's the deal. The attorney general can say, "Nah, we good. I kind of like that sheriff. I'm not even going to investigate that sheriff." And that would be the power of the attorney general to shut that down. And there would be no recourse by local attorneys, local district attorneys, county attorneys to even get an investigation of a sheriff initiated. It's only that power would rest only with the attorney general. So I told you we'd get there, right? This amendment would take power from all of the 104 county attorneys that we have, take power from the locals, who are the ones who might know when things are going awry over in the sheriff's department, and takes all power from those locals and concentrates that power in the one office of the attorney general. So a yes vote would then, of course, require that we elect our sheriffs going forward, whether a government consolidates or not, and would take power from local county attorneys and concentrate that power into the one office of the attorney general. So a no vote keeps the status quo, keeps the power concurrent with the state attorney general and all of the remaining local county attorneys. So those are the two amendments. And I know I know we're probably about the time that you allotted. But if you'd like, I'll just continue and just run through really quickly. This whole Is that okay? Okay,
Yeah,
cool.
that's fantastic. I mean, your insight is so great. I'd love to know more.
Okay. All right. Well, so let's talk about judges, okay? Because you're going to have a whole lot on your ballot this election. And so in Kansas, um, we do things. There's basically three ways that judges can be appointed or elected to the bench, and in Kansas we do all three ways. It's kind of crazy. But as a general rule, when we're talking about retention of judges, okay, because that's what we're talking about, we are going to be voting to retain, to keep certain state court judges, okay? Specifically, we're going to be voting to whether to retain our Kansas Supreme Court justices and our Kansas Court of Appeals justices, okay? So just for backdrop, so every case, every case in court starts at a trial court level. In Kansas, we call them district courts. Sedgwick County District Court. Those are trial courts. That's where every case starts. When the loser at the trial court level wants to appeal, they appeal to the Kansas Court of Appeals. Okay. Then the Kansas Court of Appeals says, "Oh, did they get that wrong down at the trial court level?" Kansas Court of Appeals makes their decision. If the party who loses at the Kansas Court of Appeals level, they don't like that, they can ask the Kansas Supreme Court to hear their case. So we have a three-layer state court system in Kansas. So what I'm going to talk about are those judges who are up for retention, who are on our Kansas State Supreme Court and our Kansas Court of Appeals, and how those judges, how we get those judges, is a process that I'll go into a little bit more. But the governor appoints our state court judges, our Supreme Court and Kansas Court of Appeals judges. And so after they're appointed by the governor, then they face retention. Okay. And that's what we vote on. Once they're appointed, then they have to answer to the voters, right? And the voters get to decide whether to retain or to vote the judges out. So let's go back. So when there's a vacancy on the bench, what happens is you'll hear this, over and over. The governor appoints vacancies on the bench. That's true, but there's an important step in the process that I think is sometimes overlooked, that I think is important when we're deciding whether to retain our judges or not, because it's not like the governor just picks out of nowhere somebody who they want to be, for example, on our Kansas Supreme Court. We have this process, at least for the Kansas Supreme Court, where we have this commission. It's called a merit selection commission. And so when there's a vacancy on the bench, a lot of people would really like to be Kansas Supreme Court justice. So they apply, and they have to provide a very, very detailed and exhaustive application process or application. And then what happens, you've got this commission. It's 9 people who live in Kansas. 4 of them are non-lawyers, 5 of them are lawyers. And what their task is to go through all of those applications and make sure that everything that the applicants told them was true and correct. And they're going to check, did you work here? Check all that background stuff. And then that committee recommends 3 names to the governor. And then the Kansas Bureau of Investigation gets involved and does thorough background checks on those 3 candidates. So, and I tell you all this because, as a general rule, our Kansas Supreme Court justices are pretty well vetted, right? So that's the process. So then the commission gives those 3 names to the governor, assuming they pass their KBI check. Then the governor chooses from those 3. So vacancy on the bench, the governor appoints based on the merit selection committee's recommendation. And then what happens is the very next general election, that judge faces retention. So what are we looking at with our judges? And then every 6 years after that, Kansas Supreme Court justices face retention. So these are our Supremes. Okay. This is the current Kansas Supreme Court, which is comprised of 7 justices, right? We know our United States Supreme Court has 9. We in Kansas, our state Supreme Court has 7 justices. So I've pulled out pictures of them all with their names and when they were appointed. So let's look at who is going to be on our ballot because they face their first general election after being appointed. So those judges, there are 3 of the 7 who were appointed in 2020 by Governor Kelly. So those 3 names, who I have the stars by, those 3 judges are going to be on your ballot, and they're on your ballot because it's their very first retention election after being appointed by the governor. All right. So now let's talk about who's going to be on your ballot, who's up for their regular 6-year retention, right? And there are 3 justices. And when we talk about the Kansas Supreme Court, we refer to them as justices, and everybody else are just judges, right? So there are 3 justices who are up for retention simply because they're up for their regular 6-year retention term. So when you look at your ballot, there will be 6 Kansas Supreme Court justices who are up for retention. 6 of the 7 are up for retention this November. So what happens if we vote them all out, right? What happens to judges who are not retained? Well, let's say we vote out all 6 of those justices. We want to smash the patriarchy, break all the rules, right? Well, what's going to happen is those justices are going to have to be replaced, right? And so who appoints Supreme Court justices? We know that the governor appoints our state Supreme Court justices. And by November 8th, we know that that is going to be either Governor Kelly or Derek Schmidt. And so when you're kind of deciding, whether to vote to retain or not, and I'm not here to tell you to retain or not, that is not my job. But what you should keep in mind is that if we don't, whichever justices we don't retain, depending on who gets elected governor, and that could very well be Derek Schmidt, it will be Derek Schmidt's opportunity to appoint 6 new Kansas Supreme Court justices. So what about our Kansas Court of Appeals? So there are 14 judges on our Kansas Court of Appeals. 7 of them are up for retention. I'm not going to go through the pictures and the names individually, but here are the list of the names of the Kansas Court of Appeals judges who will be up for retention. They're actually up every 4 years, not every 6 years. So there are a fair amount of Kansas Court of Appeals judges. So same thing here. Any judge that's not retained, right, that vacancy is going to be filled by whoever is governor. And, I haven't looked at recent polling, but 50-50 chance that could be Derek Schmidt appointing those 7 Kansas Court of Appeals judges. So when you're thinking about judges and justices, a vote yes, because it will say, shall we retain? And it will say for each individual judge and justice, shall we retain so-and-so name? And so a yes vote keeps that judge or justice, they get to keep their job. A no vote boots them out, thereby creating a vacancy on the bench. So y'all are here, so I know that you know this information, right? That voter registration ends tomorrow. Early voting starts on Wednesday, and don't forget to request a mail-in ballot. The deadline is November 1st. Do not wait till November 1st to request your mail-in ballot if that's the way that you want to vote. So that concludes my presentation, and I hope that you feel you all learned a lot. Sometimes I feel like I need to assign college credit to anybody who listens to this presentation because it's a lot. It is a lot, but I hope that at least broken down where you can at least be confident in how, okay, I know why I want to vote for this or vote this down or whatever. So there you go.
This was fantastic. I have read through the amendments several times, have checked out several websites trying to decipher what all of these words mean in the order that they were placed in because it's a little confusing. And so this was awesome so that I can confidently say that if I vote yes, I know what's going to happen. And if I vote no, I know what's going to happen next. So thank you so much for just all of your knowledge. This was incredible. We did have, oh, go for it.
Yeah. No, I was gonna say, my pleasure. And it was funny because, I worked really hard over the summer on the August 2nd Amendment. And on August 3rd, I literally took my first nap in months. And then August 4th, I literally woke up that day and I said, oh my gosh, there's another round. And so I literally spent
Mhm.
almost a month and a half just marinating in these amendments and the judges. And I mean, and
Mhm.
that's what it took. And again, I'm legally trained, and it took me a month and a half literally to go check out the state. I mean, it's just it makes no sense. If you want voters
Mhm.
to pass something, then you put it in terms that they can be like, "Yeah, I'm behind that." But, that's not what happened.
100%. I think that's when you I mean, there is a spread. I think we all thought, okay, August 2nd happened, the only amendment that we had up for vote in our Constitution, when really there's several, and how they all impact who we are and what we do every single day is really impressive and incredible to think that we have this opportunity coming up on November 8th for us to really make this happen, and this to become something that is, this we really get to have a say in our state constitution. I think we saw that on August 2nd, and we get to do that again on November 8th of really getting a say of I live here and this is how I will, this is what my thoughts are, more than
Right,
just our traditional election of our political figures.
right, right. Absolutely, and, the August 2nd amendment and the legislative veto amendment is really us saying how much trust do we have in our legislators currently, right? I mean,
Mhm.
like, so yeah, well, I'm glad
Definitely.
you found it
Well,
helpful.
there was a couple of questions that came in.
Sure.
One person asked, Megan Ray Hagan, and I'm going to pop it up here. She included an article as well, which was really interesting. I don't have my New York
Oh,
Times subscription left, and so I was like, I have to read up it, so I didn't get to read it all. But do you have any insight? It seems like sheriffs in general have an impact on our election. Does this amend what do you think that would when we elect a sheriff, let's
well,
say,
and
uh
so I'm not sure if we're talking about, having an impact on elections, like, this idea, and I'm not in the weeds politically. I tried to not be in the weeds politically so I could just focus purely on the law and all that.
yeah.
But, it's my understanding that this amendment came about because of some stuff that happened in Johnson County and
Mhm,
the sheriff trying to say that, they have power over elections and that they can
mhm,
send deputies to election polling places.
mhm.
And so this amendment, I understand, was sort of in response to
Oh,
that sort of crazy town kind of stuff.
yeah.
Um, so here's the deal. I mean, sheriffs, they don't the power of the sheriff's office, they don't have power over elections. They
Mm,
don't.
mhm.
However, where they do have power is um, if somebody has broken a law, an election law, they can, investigate, the breaking of the election law. But sheriffs don't have any power per se over elections, no matter what power they claim that they have in that regard. They don't.
I think that's a really great point for us to think about is we have election commissioners, and we have people in election that are in these spaces running our elections. But if there's legal bindingness around our elections, I know that's something that you teach in your classes is legal bindingness. That's a very technical term. So, but you know that we have to follow laws within that. And so,
Yes.
and then electing that sheriff is a part of that process as well. So I think I think it's a super interesting point to think about. Somebody else Martha had asked more about how long has the merit selection process for all of our Supreme Court justices been in practice in Kansas? Do other states use this process? Are we the only one?
So we are not the only ones. We are not outliers on how, like, we are pretty mainstream. So what we're doing in Kansas is you can, in fact, you can go on Ballotpedia and it'll give you a list of all the states and how they do their stuff. I don't I think actually I'm not going to pretend I know Kansas history, but I've heard this story over and over. And I was maybe 2 or 3 years old at the time, so I certainly had no idea. But I believe that we instituted the merit selection process back like in the late 60s. there was a situation, again, I don't know Kansas history like some do, but they call it the trifecta, where you had an outgoing governor who got voted out, who appointed his lieutenant governor for the last day, who said, "Hey, appoint me as a Supreme Court justice." And
Mm,
people were like, "That doesn't work. That was just too much." So that's when we came up, when we decided to do this merit selection commission. I will tell you, and some of you might have appreciated it, some not. But when I was talking about merit selection, um, that is like that's how we select our Kansas Supreme Court justices.
mhm,
Um, a few years back, Brownback changed the rules when it came to Kansas Courts of Appeals judges, and there is no requirement for a merit selection committee to get together to look at applicants. No requirement. So for Kansas Court of Appeals judges, the governor can just literally pick a name that they want to be on the court. Now, I will
mm,
tell you, when Governor Kelly took office, she signed an executive order and said, "I would like a merit selection committee to please investigate all of the applicants and make sure they are worthy and they have educational backgrounds and legal experience." So Governor Kelly actually, if you ever hear about that with Kansas Court of Appeals judges, that's because Governor Kelly said, "You know what you did, Brownback, doesn't, you like, that's just not like, we have to make sure that these judges are have been vetted." So Governor
mhm.
Kelly does it that way in practice currently, but of course that could go by the wayside if she doesn't get reelected. So excellent question.
Yeah, definitely. There was somebody else that was curious about they loved your presentation. They're like, "Oh my gosh, I wanna share it everywhere." But what other resources, what ways people can gather this information and we can share it with our friends and family?
So, on the amendments, that's just like you're like, I write letters to the editor, like that's like my hobby, so you can find bits and pieces of people who have studied the amendments, and hopefully they can explain this stuff in a way that you can get it right. The judges is a little bit harder. It really is, because I know, for example, the Johnson County Bar Association, they have a robust survey system. Every single attorney who practices in the Johnson County Bar has to answer a survey about all of the judges who they have appeared in front of. And so these are people who won and lost, right? Because there's always a winner and a loser. And so there is a place in Johnson County you can go and see how attorneys have said this judge is horrible, this judge is great, and you can kind of decide for yourself. And there used to be a resource that actually did sort of rate the judges. I think it was
Hmm,
like Kansans for fair courts. But I've asked around. I have asked judges. I'm like, where? Because people ask me that. I'm like, nobody's going to
mhm,
go out and read the opinions of every justice and judge. I don't, right? And so it's tough. I wish I had a magic bullet answer for you where to go and get information about, judges, for example. But I will say this, and I'm not telling you to how to vote on retaining judges, but you know, when you're thinking about that, yes, retain, no, vote them out. Um, Judges, they have a job, right? Their
mhm,
job is to interpret laws and
mhm,
apply laws to the facts of whatever case, right? And apply laws even if they don't like the law, right? We don't want judges going rogue and saying, "Oh, I don't like that law. I'm not going to follow the law. This is the result I
mm,
want." Okay,
mhm,
so that's their job. But here's the deal. Um, Take any legal issue, and you will find exceedingly brilliant and smart minds, legal scholars, professors,
mhm,
lawyers, judges who differ on how to interpret that very same law. And it doesn't make one side right or wrong. It really doesn't.
mhm,
And I spent 8 years at the federal courts. Like, I grew up in the court system. My respect for the judiciary and the role it plays in our democracy and the fairness of our society, it freaks me out a little bit, right? To think about, okay, I'm mad at this one particular judge for one case that he decided on one particular issue. Now, my knee jerk reaction is vote them out, right? But if we start cherry picking and just voting judges out based on one issue, one case, it is not healthy for our judiciary. It really isn't. Our like there are some important traditions and yeah, like it just ain't good. And so what concerns me is that, I've literally had people say to me, well, if I don't know the judge, I just vote to not retain him. And I'm like,
Mm,
this is not the time for that. I mean, it really isn't, because the stakes could not be higher, because
mhm,
whoever is elected governor gets to appoint the next slate of judges and justices. But I tell you what, even if I wasn't here contemplating potentially either, Laura Kelly or Derek Schmidt, no matter what, the institution of our judiciary, and for
mm,
people to have faith in it, right? There has to be some continuity. And I can only imagine, again, no matter who is elected governor, if we vote, for example, to vote out all six of those Kansas Supreme Court justices, well, most people, myself, lay people, I'm not going to have much faith in that institution. I'm not going to have much faith in those who are going to be appointed in the future, right? And so, I have been asked, because those who've done their research know that not all the justices and judges voted the way some of us wanted on abortion right. Like, if you
mhm,
ask anybody, I live and die on reproductive rights. Like, that's my jam.
mhm,
And
mhm,
so, I had to sort of have my own come to Jesus, because I was like, I want to go out there and tell everybody to vote out and then I really had to have some true
mhm,
introspection and reflection on my experiences in the courts, and what that would do to just literally our democracy. And I was like, you know what? One issue, one case is not
mm,
worth upending our traditions that everybody comes to rely on. And let's face it, the legislature, the governor, like, they're all fighting their political mess. But I
mhm,
hope that I can sort of be sure that my judges are doing their job, right? Even though I
mhm,
might disagree with them, as long as they're doing their job and they're not going rogue and, throwing out the law,
mhm.
and the term you were looking for was like following precedent, right? So yeah, so as long as they're doing that, we're gonna have educated disagreements about what laws and constitutions mean.
I think that's an incredible thing for us to each think about, is because we are voting on a whole section of our, like, one of our 3 pillars of democracy.
Right.
And we are literally, and it's 6/7, which is huge.
Good math. Good math
Yeah.
there.
It's like, but, like, you have this huge section that could have any sort of dramatic change. If everybody, even if it's whatever direction that each person feels is correct, no matter what it is, whether, when you bring on 6 new people to a group, it's a lot of opportunity for a lot of change, and so it's something for each of us to contemplate on when we look at those retention of justices. It could be a whole change to one portion of our government.
Agreed. And we're used to voting for our state legislators every 2
Mm,
years. Like,
mhm,
we're used to that turnover, but truly in our courts, we sort of come to depend on, as much as, sometimes, they like get some new perspectives, but we come to depend on, again, that continuity. And I was a law clerk. Like, I've
mhm.
written judicial opinions. They're like, they get better at it. Like, there's a learning curve, right? And so
Yeah.
if we're just booting them out like, we just it's
Mhm,
unstable. It really is.
mhm.
And there might be a situation down the road where, I might decide, like, different election, different circumstances. I might say,
Uh-huh.
I don't think the judge is doing their job. But I think that needs to be the standard, not Do they agree with us on every issue or on
Mhm.
even the issue that's most important to us,
Yeah.
politically? So that, yeah, and I'm telling you, I really did. I had to, it was some soul searching on my part because I'm a fighter. I'm like, damn it.
And I
I'm like,
think that's and
for
I
the
think that
good, for the good of the state, for the good, kind of thing.
And I think it's a great call to action on all of us when it comes to these amendments. Well, each of the 2 amendments and our judges that we're voting on is for each of us to take a moment and look at I think it's this is the best part of democracy and voting and so many things. It's like we get to take a moment and say, what does this mean to me? What does this mean to my state? What does this mean to my country? What does this mean to my fellow Kansans? And how am I a piece of this? Because really what we I think I feel like a broken record, but we're really creating precedent right now. And so this is a time not to just flippantly vote on a ballot, but taking that time to, I feel like every election you should do this, but very much on this one, take a time, become introspective for a little bit, figure out what things mean best to you, and be really educated when you go to the polls. Whether you're voting early, you have a paper ballot or a mail in ballot, or if you're voting day of. I think this is so awesome.
Yeah, and I'll just add on to that, and then I know everybody's probably ready to get back to their families and that kind of stuff. But I mean, you're so right. I mean, like, get educated to the best you can, but your 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 task of becoming educated on these amendments and judges are, first of all, so you can feel good about how you're voting. But how many people know that you're associated with the League of Women Voters? So they come up to you and you're
Mhm.
like, hey, what's this amendment about? Do you have any thoughts
Yeah.
on it? So that you can at least have a cursory conversation about, well, this is what I learned. This, I saw this presentation and this is what this is going to mean. And you're not
Uh-huh.
telling others to how to vote, right? But at least being educated enough, because some of us get asked because we're associated with certain groups, and it's nice to have some sort of an answer, and so to have thought out that a little bit ahead of time, and which is why I spent so much time
Mhm.
putting this presentation together, because I don't expect anybody, some of y'all probably knew everything that I talked about, but I don't expect for those who watch the presentation to be able to go and say, okay, in a consolidated government, this happens. Yeah, like, but just to have faith that, okay,
Mhm.
I was getting it as we were talking about, and I can maybe, do a little bit. So that's all I want, is just for you to feel confident in however you vote, that you now have current, accurate, truthful information, and that if somebody asks you, you might be able to at least have a cursory conversation about, what you learned today.
Definitely. I am so thankful that you were with us tonight and that you shared this great information. This video will live in perpetuity on our Facebook page and our YouTube. So please feel free to share it with anybody that you know in the state of Kansas or beyond. We have a lot of people that are always interested in constitutional amendments and judges and laws. And I just want to thank you so much for your time and your energy. And we will see you all here soon. Have a great night.
Awesome. Thank you for having me.